All right, guys, welcome to another episode of E4 Explicit Podcast. I'm Corey, and today we have, for a third time and a second time, Anthony Davies and James Harrigan from Arizona. You're still in Arizona, right, James? And then
Oh yeah,
you're in, aren't you in Pittsburgh, Anthony?
Pittsburgh, Duquesne
Pittsburgh.
University.
Yes. So thank you again for coming on, and I think it's like an ideal time to talk to two experts in your lanes because of everything that's kind of going on. So I just wanted to touch base on everything moving since we talked last time, and you guys were pretty much spot on last time we talked. You pretty much predicted the election. You pretty much predicted what was going to happen, and we're still in those predictions. Really, I mean, they were spot on, which blew my mind. I was so certain Trump was going to win. I was like 100%. I was like, "There's no way!" Like Biden can't even talk. Blah blah blah. And next thing you know, it's not the case. But first off, I just wanted to kind of talk real quick. I know it's a little bit dated, but the attack on Capitol Hill and stuff like that. I was wondering. I was curious of your guys' take about that situation and kind of like now what's happening with the second impeachment and kind of who really should be, or if anybody should be kind of held accountable at a higher power, not just the people that were doing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can't speak to who should be held accountable. I don't know enough details, but what struck me is the hypocrisy of the whole thing. You know, we had these riots in Seattle and, destroying property, and a couple of people died. We had the riots in Capitol Hill, same kind of thing. And and we had politicians, and there were a whole bunch of them, but Kamala Harris stands out as being, our new vice president, who went on the news at the Seattle riots saying these people are not going to stop and they shouldn't. And then at the Capitol Hill riots saying, this has got to stop immediately. And granted, there are different motivations behind each of the riots, and that's not unimportant from one perspective, but from another perspective, they're both in terms of outcome are the same thing. You've got people who are annoyed and taking out their anger on innocent people and on property. And either that's a good thing to do or it isn't, but it's not good in one place and bad in another.
Yeah, and I'll follow that up, Ant, by just saying that it's been very clear for, I think, decades that we've got a double standard, at least in the way the press presents certain things, and maybe even as a result, the way that we interpret certain things. And when we see leftist organizations making a mess of things out in the West, the news media tends to see that and say, well, they're doing this for a good cause, because their interests all align with the interests of the media. Whereby in the East, right, when they take over the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., that in no way links up with the journalist who covers that sort of thing with their ideas and their beliefs. So all of a sudden we present it very differently there. And you're going to see that a lot in the Biden administration, right? You already see it, where he's being treated with kid gloves, and it's almost a fawning on the part of the media. No Republican will ever get that kind of treatment, and Trump especially would never get that kind of treatment. Now, I'm not a big Trump fan, and I do think he is largely responsible for the riot that we saw. But the press has something to account for here. And unless they do it sometime soon, you can expect the same kind of results down the road.
And we're talking about hypocrisy here. And I think it's important to point out that the left doesn't have a monopoly on hypocrisy. We've seen it recently on the other side as well. So, some time ago, people on the right were saying, with regard to the baker out in the West, that he should not be required to bake a cake for gay marriage. It's a private business, and he should be free to do what he wants with his private business. But then when Facebook starts censoring people on the right, all of a sudden this is a free speech violation. No, it's not. Facebook is a private company. If the principle of I can do what I want with my property applies to the baker, then it applies to Facebook as well. If it doesn't apply to the baker, then it doesn't apply to Facebook.
Right. I totally agree with that. That kind of is it brings me to my next kind of topic with all these executive orders, and you talk about hypocrisy. Like, I feel like that's like just today or yesterday, like the travel ban. He let the travel ban slide. Biden did, and now he's reinstating the travel bans, and it's kind of in the media. From what I've seen, it's been like applauded and praised. And a year ago when it was done, it was met with racism and all these things that that we're not seeing today. And I don't know if that's obviously, I think the media, like you said, James, is kind of like probably the main thing that's really pushing people's agendas and like what we're taking in and kind of leaving it to interpret ourselves, which isn't the best idea. But I was just kind of like seeing the same things happening in similar administrations. And Anthony, you mentioned this in one of your posts the other day of like, there's not really that much different happening in the administrations.
I got so much flack for that post.
But if you break it down, it's kind of, you're not wrong.
No, in terms of, I mean, clearly there are differences, but in terms of the big things that occupy our minds, Guantanamo Bay, less so now, but it was a huge thing a decade or so ago. Guantanamo Bay, interfering with in other countries militarily, the debt, it goes on and on. The millions of Americans who are imprisoned for victimless crimes. It doesn't matter whether your president is Democrat or Republican. These problems persist. And it's not even a matter of, well, we had a president there who wanted to do the right thing, but Congress stood against him. They persist even when the president and the Congress are the same party.
Right. And, I was like Nostradamus with some predictions on this with this last election, right? Because it's pretty simple to point out that every 4 years, people line up behind this one and that one, and they claim that their guy has all the right answers and everything out of the other guy's mouth is stupid. Meanwhile, I keep pointing out that no matter who we elect, we get the same outcomes. So who of us is more due for a refresher course on how government works? And I think you look at the true believers on either side, and they're wholly unreasonable. They expect things that will literally never happen. We have all kinds of verifiable evidence that it never happens, and yet every 4 years I'm right back to the same thing with these people. And it's enough to make you crazy.
Yeah, and on this post that I made that created this storm, that's a lot of people's responses were along the lines of what James is saying. They were saying, no, this is going to be different. Look at what Biden has promised to do. He promised to do this, this, and this. I said, don't tell me what he promised to do. Tell me what he actually does. Because Trump promised to do a lot. Obama promised to do a lot. Clinton promised to do a lot. Yeah.
And, in my lifetime, I think one president was successful at this, and it was Reagan. And that was 1988 when he left office. And we haven't seen the likes of him again. So, draw your own conclusions, but at least take history into account.
Right. Yeah, no, that's something that I learned the first time I talked to Anthony was I was so surprised of how the government actually is supposed to work. You think that, and I think it's, James, you mentioned this last time, is it's ridiculous to think that someone can go in 4 years, change, the ship 180 degrees. It's impossible. Right. And everybody complains of, oh, my president's going to go in there and do this and do that. And I remember Anthony telling me, like, that's not how government's supposed to work. It's supposed to be slow. It's supposed to, take a long time for things to happen. So someone can't just go in and, essentially fuck shit up and just do what their, lobbyists or people behind them want them to do immediately, which I think that's what we're kind of seeing here, aside from these executive orders that are just like, he did like 30 in one day. Which, I think those are like little things that are just kind of like padding him a little bit to make him look like he's doing all these great things so quickly to kind of like reverse everything Trump did. Whether that's bad or good, we don't know yet. But I just find it so fascinating that like that it's people conceive government is like supposed to be quick and work fast and work for us, but it's the complete opposite, right?
That's right. It's our government was designed to be inefficient. It creates a situation in which people who occupy the governing institutions are always fighting each other. Right? They each have a different institutional incentive to behave in a certain way, and they almost always go for it because people want to conserve what little power they have, and they don't want to end up losing it to another political branch. But the end result is that you get a phenomenally difficult government within which to play, right? Whatever you want to do. People like me say, isn't that great? Thinking that, okay, that keeps us away from brown shirts and things like this. People who want to govern other people, on the other hand, think it's terrible, right? They wish it could just be streamlined. For my money, it's been streamlined too much already. I would like to see us walk it back a bit. And executive orders are a nice example, right? I'm never going to make the case that a president doesn't have the authority to do it, because George Washington did it in the first administration, right? The ink wasn't dry on the Constitution yet when he was doing it. So I think we have to at least look at that and say, okay, maybe. But what about becomes the open question, right? And when you talk about a travel ban, how on earth is that not a legislative function? How do we look at that and think, oh no, Congress has nothing to do with that? These things share in the nature of laws for the most part. And if they look like laws and they walk like laws and so on and so forth, they're laws. And if they are, you get the president out of the room. He's there to sign the laws and execute them, not to make them. And that's really the difference that we've got right now.
But some of these executive orders, and I didn't look through all of them, but some of them are window dressing. And I know this from personal experience or firsthand experience. One of the executive orders that Joe Biden signed was requiring that people who are coming into the country be tested and test negative for COVID prior to coming in. I have a friend who came into the country from Scotland to UK to US, and he arrived in the US the day before Biden was sworn in. And he had to go through this. That rule was already in place. The Health and Human Services required the negative test before he could come into the country. And so at least in that one instance, that executive order was simply window dressing to make it look like I'm fixing problems that Trump had created, when in fact he was simply saying, keep doing what you're doing.
Right. That's kind of what I kind of got from a lot of them, because it was, some of them were like said to do 8-9 months ago that just were never done. And then the what's it called? The Mitch McConnell and all those guys, it seemed to me that like now that the second impeachment's kind of coming along, and I don't know if it's true or not that now he's not a president, he's not protected or whatever it is, but it seems like Mitch McConnell's kind of like, I don't know if he's going to go through with it or not in the Senate, but he's kind of doesn't really need Trump anymore, because I think he's got they got the Supreme Court kind of fixed up now, I think. But you know, and obviously this is just me being a dumbass and just guessing and kind of just saying things that I see on the news. But you know, do you think that a second impeachment and actually it go through would happen? And if it did, what would that even mean anyway, since he's not even the president?
Okay, here's the thing. If we proceed with impeachment, take a long look at who's leading the cheer to go impeach him a second time and then convict him. Because I can almost with 100% certainty guarantee that those people are interested in the 2024 election. What they're trying to do is impeach him so that he can never run for office again. And what does that have the net effect of doing? It takes him as a competitor off the stage. So you're going to see a number of high-profile Republicans very likely to break ranks on this and vote to convict, because they're going to run for president, and the last thing they want is an ex-president that they have to run against. So, of course it does, which is exactly why it's going to happen. Right? If it doesn't happen, it's that their calculations were such that they didn't think he was going to cause them any bit of a threat in the upcoming election. So that's it. If they think he can retake the office, they will vote to convict. If they think it's just a kind of a sad clown show, they'll let it go. But it's all going to be about what people think is going to happen in terms of the next election. If I were running for president in 2024, which, by the way, I am, we'll talk about that later. If I were running as a Republican in 2024, I would do everything I could to take 1,000 chunks out of him, because he's going to have the benefit of a 4-year presidency running for the office. And by 4 years' time, we're all going to be a little sick and tired of Joe Biden. right? And it's going to be an easier race for a Republican next time than it was this time.
Right. Do you think that it would be smart for my girl Tulsi to switch sides and go Republican since she's more in the middle than any person, and the DNC hates her anyways?
Yeah, I think she's actually kind of crazy with a lot of her positions. A lot of the rest of them are perfectly reasonable. And it seems that we're being prepared for a Justin Amash ticket that probably includes her.
Wow.
And it would
Because-
be it would be really interesting if it were Amash Republican, Gabbard Democrat on the same ticket.
Yeah, that's right.
Has
and
that ever
Antony
happened?
advised, my presidential history isn't up to snuff. I want to say yes, but I can't point to the exact times it happened.
But there's nothing prohibiting it.
No,
There's
no,
nothing
and they could-
prohibiting it, and it would serve as a rallying point for a lot of people who are tired of the back and forth between the two parties.
Yeah, and Antony, I don't remember which of the Democrats was that we were thinking at the time, but we opined
Romney.
early on. It was Mitt Romney. Yeah, so we thought maybe Mitt Romney and Tulsi Gabbard would make a very compelling ticket, and I'm still thinking down that line. Romney might not be the right guy. He was in the last election. He would have done quite well if he had worked as a third party there. Or even if he tried to primary Trump out of it. But the Gabbard angle is interesting.
I'm not a fan by any means of unified government in that sense, but the divisiveness has gone on for so long that if we could have a reasonable Democrat and a reasonable Republican on the same ticket, I think it would be healing for the country.
Yeah, I agree. And Tulsi Gabbard makes me nervous, but she doesn't make me any more nervous than anybody else that's looking for that office.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of, that was my take on her. She was like the kind of like, she did have some crazy ideas and stuff like that, but most of her stuff was kind of like mid-level playing field. But she just wasn't like, that's why I asked you guys in the last time we talked you guys knew he was going to pick Kamala Harris. You wanted him to pick Rice, I think it was. Not Condoleezza Rice, the other.
Condoleezza Rice Condoleezza.
Oh yeah, but then there was in there another Rice.
Susan, yeah.
Susan. Right. So, but
Bit of a lunatic.
yeah, right. And she also got the fall big time for, I think, the Hillary thing, Benghazi or whatever. But anyways, what was I saying? Kamala was just a bigger name, right? So a lot of people are saying like Biden's obviously kind of maybe losing his mind or whatever it is. And is this just kind of like the best and easiest way to get a woman into the presidency? And, if he goes 8 years, I don't think he'll last a full 8 years, like just like health wise. Is this, you know what I mean? Like, would that kind of allow her to just steamroll it and kind of like take over? Or do you think in 4 years we're going to see another kind of gigantic shift?
Well, who knows? I don't think Kamala Harris added much to the ticket, right? And his numbers didn't spike after he picked her. So it was kind of a net zero effect for picking her as the VP. I hate talking about things like this. Excuse me. But, it may be the case that Joe Biden is too old to see 2 terms. And, if he dies in office, she goes right to the Oval Office. If he doesn't die in office, it's hard for me to imagine another path for her that gets her into the presidency. Right? She's just not liked. Most people don't trust her all that much. Right? I think Joe Biden thinks better of her than anybody else in the country. Because I was not impressed when he picked her, and I don't know anybody else who was.
Yeah.
And I get it wanting a female candidate, but there were far, far better female candidates.
We're back to Condoleezza Rice, yeah.
Yeah, and even on the stage, when Gabbard, I think, was interesting, but Kamala Harris has a bad history of
Right.
Throwing people, particularly minorities, into jail for victimless crimes.
Right, and she's very proud of it.
Right, exactly. I was going to say, you could say, well, it was her job, but on the other hand, she seemed to enjoy it quite a bit.
She did, and that's the kind of thing that you should be ashamed of.
If you take away the female aspect of it, so imagine a 2024 race with Kamala Harris at the top of the Democratic ticket and a female at the top of the Republican ticket, I think now her faults come out to the fore.
Sure.
For sure. Yeah.
But only then.
Right.
Right. Only then.
Yeah. And speaking of hypocrisy, I thought it was kind of odd and funny. It's great. It's a first woman vice president, but wasn't she a cop?
Yeah, and then Attorney General in California, which is when she did the bulk of her damage.
Right. So I just thought it was so funny that like left anti-cop, anti this, anti that, and then now in the basically the highest office on the planet, we have a former police officer, which is just kind of, it is what it is. But I just thought it was just funny.
I don't know that she ever was a police officer. That would be, I should know that, but I don't. I'll have to look into that.
I thought she was a cop from what things that I've seen and I've read, but once again, don't believe everything you read and see. But if that's true, that's crazy. So that's what I was going to ask about as far as like terms, right? So the president, well, I don't know what year it was when Congress came together and said, okay, you get 2 terms of 4 years, right?
Yeah, it's a constitutional amendment.
Oh shit! All right, so a long time ago.
Why that was is that after FDR?
Okay, why isn't that the case with the like congressmen and women? Like they can basically sit forever, right?
Yeah, they can, and it was the Supreme Court of the United States made that determination, right? When term limits became an issue, probably 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, 20. The Supreme Court weighed in on this, and there was no way to make those constitutional apart from having an amendment. So it was U.S. term limits v. Thornton was the case that they did this, and the year escapes me. But whenever somebody says, "Oh, we need to have term limits," they're just proving to you that they don't do much reading, because it's literally impossible to have term limits. You can't do it. If to do it, it would take the amendment. Nobody ever talks about the amendment. So you come to realize pretty early on that anybody who's throwing mud around this idea of term limits is just looking for attention, right? That they have to know that it's not possible. 3 seconds on Google tells you that it's unconstitutional. So then you ask the second question, why on earth is everybody agitating for this? And the answer is that the people kind of like hearing that stuff. Right? We have a perpetually dim view of Congress. If you look at public opinion research done on Congress, they get about an 18% approval rating on a pretty good day. And then a very weird thing happens. You poke at the people a little bit and say, okay, what about your congressman? And then the answer is almost universally, my congressman is fine. It's all the other ones. And you realize that as a matter of logic, that's not possible. And yet that's where we end up. So, there's where we are. People become a little irrational, a little unreasonable, but kind of predictable.
Well, yeah, and I would phrase it differently, James. I think it's perfectly rational when we understand what we have over time come to ask government to do. What we ask it to do is to take things away from other people and give it to me.
Give them to us. That's
and
right.
So from that perspective, I love my congressman. He's going to be giving me stuff, but I hate all the other ones. They're the ones who are going to take it away.
And, look, I know where you guys live. You've probably driven through West Virginia. Literally everything in that state is named after Robert Byrd, right? The senator who brought all the money back to West Virginia. The entire, I'm surprised the state isn't named after him. But there you are, right? So, and I think, Ant, you're right. We do expect certain things, and we don't want certain other things.
Right. So, and so that's why someone like Pelosi can be. I just look at it as like as another human. Like, okay, if someone started office when they were in their 30s and they're still in office when they're 60s and 70s, their views probably haven't changed. They're still the same type of person. They're just going with what other people in the public are approving of and saying. I just think it's interesting and kind of baffles me that that's even a thing, but that makes sense.
Right. And, when you look at reelection rates, they're pretty damn good. It's not, I wouldn't mind having that kind of job security. But in the end, it's still the voters. That's the last thing in the chain. And if you can prevail upon them, they will vote differently. But most people can't do it. So there you go.
That's so funny when you think of it like that. I never even thought of it like if you just make it, when it does come down to votes, these people are still in there for a reason. So
that's right. And look at what happens, right? Robert Byrd starts bringing all that pork back to West Virginia, and people say, "Go, Robert, go get us some more." And before you know it, there's not even a Republican opposition, right? Robert Byrd wins by acclamation every 6 years or so, and that happens with the congressman as well, right? As long as they're doing just enough of the things their constituency wants, they'll get reelected, regardless of how destructive what they want is to the rest of the country.
God damn, man.
And we come now, as we do repeatedly, to the reason why a constitution is so incredibly important.
Right.
Because it's human nature that we're going to end up where we ended up, which is, I want my congressman to bring me as much as he possibly can. I want other congressmen not to take from me. And you get there if you don't have a constitution that says the federal government may not do the following things. And we've just completely ignored ours, and hence this is the problem we have now. And it spills over into the economics, our $28 trillion debt. It spills over societally, the division between us. We're at each other's throats precisely because we have allowed the federal government to grow so large that it intrudes on every portion of our lives.
Yeah, and we didn't have to do that. There are interesting ways to avoid doing that. But I want to say, look, even with a constitution, it only took about 110 years or so to get where we got. Right? Well, maybe 130. And now we're there, and there's no getting away from it, right? But think about it this way. Think about how incentives work and what you would want to incentivize your governing authorities to do. And let's say that we all stipulate that we should have a balanced budget. That's not crazy talk. That's something that should have happened from day one, right? We always should have had a balanced budget because that's what responsible people do. Okay, they're irresponsible. They're not going to do that. I propose the following. If they don't offer us a balanced budget, which is signed by the president into law, everybody goes to jail. You would see their behaviors change on a dime. They would act completely differently. That next day, all of American life would change. So that's what you've got to do. You've got to align the incentives correctly. And the incentives now are aligned in such a way that the congressmen really have to start worrying about their reelection the day after they're elected. That's when the next campaign starts. And if all they care about is reelection, and trust me, it's all they care about, well, you're going to get this kind of answer every time. So you, as the people, you've got to come up with better incentives or make the current ones much more painful than they now are.
Yeah, and this is really important because too many people think the answer to our problems is electing the right people. We just have to get the right person.
My eye's going to pop out if I hear that one more time. God.
Yeah, that's not the problem is the incentives themselves. You can populate the entire thing with saints and you'll still have this outcome.
Right. So that let's talk about I heard the word budget in there from James. I know that this new stimulus bill, 1.9 trillion or whatever it is. I know that I don't know. Anthony you probably went crazy as an economist. It's just like your head probably exploded.
I'm numb to it now.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
a trillion here, a trillion there.
Yeah,
what could possibly go wrong?
Right. Who's going to pay this back? We could just print some more and make the dollar even less valuable. But I was blown away with because I didn't read the whole thing obviously because I saw a clip of Tulsi Gabbard. She was upset because they texted her, "Hey, here's the bill. Read it. It's like 5,600 pages. You have till tomorrow, the next day, and that's why she voted against it."
I believe it was 4. I thought it was 4 hours.
Oh yeah, it might have been like the next couple hours of the next day. Yeah, which is insane. Insane. Right. So,
well, but it's not though, right? Because Corey, think back when they passed the Affordable Care Act, somebody got all over Nancy Pelosi and said, "Well, what the hell's in it?" And she said, "We'll pass it, and then you'll find out what's in it."
Oh my God, she really said that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, she said, in fact, she wasn't speaking to the person like, "We'll pass it, you'll find out what's in it."
No,
she said, we have to pass it to figure out what's in it.
Yeah.
What?
Well, look, it's not possible to have read it. It's just not possible. So what do? They start with a bare bones thing that's made its way through committee. They jack it up with all kinds of extraneous nonsense. It gets to 5,200, 5,300 pages. They pass it knowing that nobody will ever check in time and will be on to the next outrage a couple of days from now anyway.
Wow.
Right. And they can cheer and say they've overhauled healthcare and get reelected.
Yeah.
And by the time we figure out what was in it, well,
But
they're on to the next thing. They've already
yeah,
been reelected.
and thinking back to where we started just now, are you better off now that Obamacare is there? The law of the no, nobody's better off, right? You're at best moving sideways and at worst way underwater on that thing.
And this is really interesting because we were promised repeatedly, not once, this is repeatedly, we were promised that the Affordable Care Act would reduce the cost of health care. And I forget what he said, but he mentioned specific numbers. It was like by $2,000 per household.
Right.
Reduce the cost of health insurance, and everyone would be insured.
My
Now,
cost of insurance.
Here we are all these years later, and you can look at you could track the average price of health insurance across time, and it's rising, rising, rising at a very steady, almost a straight line. We get to the Affordable Care Act, and it keeps on rising at the exact same rate. Nothing changed. And when you look at the number of insured people, yes, it is the case there are fewer uninsured people by like 10 or 15 million. But we're nowhere near zero. We're still at like 20 million people uninsured. So all this stuff we were promised just didn't materialize. Oh,
Right,
but we did get a huge new government agency out of it.
Well, that's all that really matters, right? And look, I can tell you that my healthcare costs quadrupled. Quadrupled. 4 times, and it was expensive to begin with. I was already paying like $6,000-8,000 at the point of inception here, and that got up over 30 when it was so high. It was so fucking high that I had to make the calculated judgment of not having insurance. It was cheaper for me to pay the fine.
Yeah.
A lot cheaper. So I paid the fine. I'm like, well, fuck it. I can't afford the insurance. I'll pay the fine. And I couldn't really afford that either, frankly, at the time. But there it was, and if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. My ass, where have you been that you would say that? I can't keep a doctor for any more than a year. Apparently.
Same. I know it's constant. It's funny. I was sold on Obamacare simply because of I have a pre-existing heart condition. I've had 3 open heart surgeries, so. As an adult, it was very difficult for me to get insured. I could kind of stay on my mom's when I was a kid, but as an adult, it was very difficult without, a year or 2 of them at a job and this and that. And as a freelance filmmaker, definitely didn't have someone paying for my insurance until I got like a real job in that field. But I've never paid more out of pocket for healthcare just because I also have to go to my cardiologist at Children's in DC and like all these ridiculous things, which make the cost go even higher. I can't just have a normal primary. I have to have all these other things. It's insane. It's like paying 2 rents every month, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And notice the interesting thing here. You're talking about the pre-existing condition and the fact that you change jobs and that creates problems, which we all understand. And we understand it at such a base level, we forget that it's not supposed to be that way. You lose your insurance when you change employers. That's weird. I don't lose my car insurance. I don't lose my home insurance when I change employers. And the reason we do is because the federal government back in the 40s and 50s imposed price controls on wages. It told employers you may not pay your workers more than a certain amount. And so what did employers do? They said, well, I got to attract talent. I'm not allowed to pay them more. I'll pay your health insurance. And all of a sudden, health insurance became part of your job because it was the market trying to deal with this restriction that government placed on them. And now, what does the government do? It turns around and says, look, we've got pre-existing condition problems. Yes, we do. You caused them.
Right. I remember you telling me that on our first time that I didn't even know why. I always wondered why, like everyone's like, oh yeah, I got a great job. It's got great health care. And I'm like, what? Like, that's always been like a good thing, and it's a shame that it has to be a good thing for you to have, a healthy life and be able to, have coverage. That's insane. Well, so as far as the stimulus bill goes, aside from the healthcare and stuff like that, I was trying to understand like why there's so much money. And like you kind of answered it already of like, they just throw things in there that we're going to catch a year or 2 from now or 4 or 5 years from now. There's an enormous amount of cash going to places like Iran or Pakistan with like gender courses and gender studies and all these things that have nothing to do with COVID vaccinations or helping the American people get through this pandemic, is nothing to do with COVID. And all these countries are getting billions of dollars. I think it was like $176 billion going to the US people, and then like 6 or 500 billion going to like foreign countries. How and why is that possible?
I'm pretty sure those numbers are incorrect.
I guarantee you they're incorrect. They're coming from me.
We tend not to spend that much internationally, right? Our foreign aid budget is a drop in the bucket compared to what we really spend everywhere else. And what you find is that most people rail against the foreign aid budget when they see that we have a budget deficit to begin with, but it wouldn't make any difference. And what we're really buying, it's not humanitarian money that we're sending. We're buying political obedience. So we're keeping people on the hook in foreign countries to keep them acting in line with American interests. So it's always a little more nefarious than it sounds. Right? That is a bullshit way to go about your business as a country, but we've been doing it for years. And I remember living in Iraq, seeing the State Department people come rolling up, and the deference they were paid by the locals. Right? It was really quite something. So don't lose your mind about the foreign money. Lose your mind about what kind of foreign money. And I also read the gender studies nonsense. I think that was going to Afghanistan or Pakistan. Things like this are just asinine. But that's people with hobby horses kind of running into the discussion to get what they want. And they're able to get what they want because it's so little, comparatively speaking. So if somebody says, I'll give you my vote on this stimulus package if you give me $10 million to fund a bunch of nonsense back in my district, that's a deal that's going to get made every time. And then you have to look. And then people say, well, look at what the Democrats do. They spend all their money on this. I can guarantee you that it was a way to buy a vote. And the more ridiculous it gets, the more likely it was to have bought a vote in the past. So really, don't lose your mind about that. Lose your mind about whether we needed a stimulus package or not in the first place. And Ant, you ran some numbers on this. Do you have them at your disposal?
Well, I was thinking, I don't know if this is the one you were thinking of, but what annoyed me about the stimulus package, we said, okay, we need $4 trillion. This was back in April, May. $4 trillion in stimulus. And what happens? There's a bunch of money goes here, goes there, and people got checks for couple $100 something, but do the math. Step back and think about this for a minute. We have 320 million people in this country. For $4 trillion, the government could have cut every single one of us a check for $10,000. So if you're in a household with 5 people, that's $50,000. Every man, woman, and child could have gotten $10,000. Now, what do you do with that? Some people save it, some people spend it, some people invest it, but that would have taken care of the matter. That would have stimulated the economy. That money would have come back to businesses. But what did the people get? They got a couple $100 and per household.
And then all of the politicians who made sure they got that made sure all of their cronies got quite a lot more in the form of all these other disbursements.
Yep.
Right. So if you accept as fact, and I'm not sure I do, but what the hell? If you accept as fact that the government should be putting money in the pockets of the people, given all of the inputs that we had, well, okay, I can see that. I might not have done it myself, but it's not crazy. What's crazy is that you take the least efficient way and choose that. Mm-hmm. What would have made the most sense is you choose the most efficient manner possible to get money from the government coffers into the people's hands. And the way to make that happen was always direct payment to people. That's always the correct answer. So when you hear people whining about welfare and they say what we should do is just give people the government cheese and the government butter and things like this. No, what you should do is give them money, because it's the most efficient thing you can do. And then they, knowing the interior realities of their lives, they should spend that money as they see fit. They know what they need. Government doesn't, right? And there you go. So, we're saying that this money should have been given out directly, and Ant runs the numbers to prove that it would have been a very, very sizable amount of money going into everybody's hands. And of course, that's not what they wanted. They didn't want to help people. They wanted to look good, to appear as if they helped people. And that's it. And a bunch of special interests got their pockets filled with this money before the people did. Well, of course they did. These are politicians we're talking about. And until we demand better, we'll never get better.
Right. That's the road I wanted to go down, was because I think I saw, and when you posted that, the numbers were just insane to me. And every man, woman, and children, they put so many regulations. I didn't even get either one of the stimuluses. And I'm like, how I didn't make that much money to not qualify. So whether I fell through the cracks or not, it didn't kill me, because $1,200 that's a drop in the bucket to all my bills and what I have to do on a monthly basis anyway. So I can only imagine with someone else who's struggling I'm lucky enough to keep my job and have my job, but how do we demand more? Because like I think it was so like eye-opening and obvious that they did not give a shit about the American people, just from the amounts that they were throwing around. When you do the basic math of, well, 4 trillion divided by 320 million doesn't equal $600.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the fact of the matter is, and James is absolutely correct, the politician's goal almost always is not to solve a problem. It's to appear to be solving a problem so that they can actually solve their own problem, which is how to get elected. So, and once you realize that actually, in a perverse way, politicians have an incentive for problems to persist. Because the longer a problem persists, the more they can use it and say, yeah, I tried my best to solve this. We couldn't solve it, but elect me one more time because I've got a new idea. We're going to solve it this time. And hence you have, as we do, the debt that goes on, the people in jail that go on, just regardless of which party's in control. As long as the problem persists, politicians can keep using it to get reelected.
And Ant and I wrote about this phenomenon in our recent book, Cooperation and Coercion, where we talked about the government's war on 3 nouns: terror, poverty, and drugs. We ran the numbers on this too, and how much do you think we've spent on those 3 wars against nouns? And it was almost exactly the federal debt. It was $22 or so trillion back when the federal debt was $22 or so trillion. So we have been fighting these wars for a very long time.
Yeah, that's the total amount of money that we've spent on all welfare programs combined since the inception, was roughly equal to what we have in the federal debt now.
It's crazy.
And what's happened? Our poverty rate hasn't changed from, it was actually dropping in this country precipitously up until Johnson started the war on poverty. And at that point, the poverty rate flattened out at about 13%, and that's where it's been ever since.
Yep.
We've spent over $20 trillion in the war on poverty, and the poverty numbers are exactly where they have always been.
And I say this all the time when I talk about the war on drugs. How successful do you think that was going to be in the first place, given that the American people, indeed people all over the earth, want them? And as long as people want something, it's going to keep going. And I always give this example to older people who want to keep prosecuting this war. I say, well, look, we can go to a city that I've never been in, and you could bring me to the downtown area, and we'll go to a restaurant for dinner, and I can walk out of that restaurant with whatever drug I want as long as I can get into the kitchen. Because that's where people who do drugs end up working. Anybody who's ever worked high-end restaurant work knows what the kitchen is like. And I'm telling you, you can get whatever you want in 3 minutes. And if you can't get it there, just start asking 15-year-olds outside where to get it, and you'll be able to get it then. In fact, half the country now has thrown in the towel on marijuana legislation. They don't even want to hear it anymore because who cares? I mean, honestly, who gives a shit that you're locking people up for a funny weed that you don't like? But, we're going to be here for quite some time, and we're going to dump good money after bad down this hole, and we'd be far better off just stopping. But who's got the incentive to keep it going? Tough on crime legislators. That's how they get elected. They tell their constituents, "I locked those bastards up when they were bothering you here in your nice homes." Right? No, where do these people never talk about being tough on crime? In the places where there is crime. You never see them go into a low income neighborhood talking about tough on crime nonsense. Right? That's what you say in the high income neighborhood, because that's what those people are afraid of. And this gets more disgusting the more you think about it.
It really does. It really does. I've been watching a lot of, I know it's documentaries and stuff, but just hearing a lot of podcasts and people talking about the war on drugs and like how, certain countries like Spain or in other countries just never like criminalized, like major stuff like heroin and cocaine and all this other stuff. And, they haven't really had any problems, but it was more of like an incentive, like you're saying, to make money and keep, putting certain people down. I think it was. It's just crazy to me that like, if, I don't know, do you think the federal government should step in at that point and like regulate it, like did alcohol and all that other stuff? I mean, would that, bring money into the economy? Would that kind of like make everything just, it's kind of crazy that you go to jail for putting something in your own body in America.
It's kind of crazy.
So yeah, it's insane. So, I mean,
but
that
the regulation
happen,
angle, right? The regulation angle doesn't exactly play here, because we didn't regulate alcohol back when. We had a constitutional amendment to give us prohibition, because everybody stipulated at the time that the federal government might wanted to have done this, but it didn't have the power to do this. So they went out, they got a constitutional amendment passed, and then they banned alcohol from the amendment. Some years later, people looked around and said, this is just fucking ridiculous. And they had another amendment giving alcohol back. But so if you look at drugs, you have to know, if the government needed a constitutional amendment to ban to ban ownership of alcohol, it would also need the same kind of amendment to ban ownership of drugs. And no amendment comes to mind, right? None of them do this. This is purely a legislative play, and then it's an executive branch play. So where's the honesty in the system? It's nowhere to be found. Not surprising, right? And I think all drugs should be legal. Why on earth do we make this class okay and not that class? But then again, look, I can tell you, I've been to Amsterdam a number of times, and their rules are reasonably clear that if it's natural, you can have it, and if it's at the end of a production line, you can't. So what can you have? You can have marijuana, hashish, and mushrooms. What can't you have? Heroin and crack and things like this. And you can see where that distinction actually makes a fair amount of sense when you know how these things work. So I could go for that too. If you wanted to find middle ground, I could go for that. But barring all ownership across the entire country, by what standard? By what right do they even claim to do this? And meanwhile, they've got marijuana on the same schedule as cocaine. I mean, come on. How clueless do you have to be? Those are people who never tried either one of those things that put them in the same list, right? and everybody who's tried both of those things knows that they're not even close to the same. I'm not saying I speak from personal experience here, but I speak from personal experience here. And it just gets revolting when you see how politicians politicize these things, because what they're politicizing is ruining people's lives.
Yep.
And how can you do that without? How do you look yourself in the mirror when you? I just don't get it. These are terrible, terrible people. Well, we could get to lizards soon,
Okay,
I guess, if we must. If we must.
We don't got to go down that route. But all right, well, Anthony, tell me what are your projections for our new stimulus bill? Trillion here, trillion there. What do you see happening if they really, now they're talking about giving every household over a year $3,000 per child in monthly payments? I think I agree with you. I agree with you guys. If you're going to do it and you take government money that way, they should just give us a check for 10 grand, every single one of us, instead of giving money to all these other places. But, it's just crazy that they think it's $1,200 check and a $600 check, $1,800 we're going on a year now, can do anything for anyone in the entire country, when $15 an hour can't even let whatever the stat is, a single mom pay for a 2-bedroom apartment, right? I don't know if that's true anymore, but I remember
Yeah.
that was like a big thing. Like how does that happen, and where do we go from here as far as like the economic side of things?
Well, in terms of what we can expect, I think we have seen the last of sub-trillion dollar deficits. I think trillion dollar plus deficits are going to be forevermore. In fact, if Biden indeed gets the kind of stimulus he's looking for now, and we repeat it maybe one more year, $2+ trillion deficits may be the norm. This past year in 2020, the federal government's deficit was higher than its revenue. So it brought in like whatever it was, more than twice as high. It brought in roughly $3.5 to $4 trillion in revenue. That's all revenue combined, and it spent like $6 to $7 trillion in spending. It was ungodly. Now we won't have that much spending this year, but I think we're going to have a lot, and it's going to come from printing money. You mentioned the $3,000 per kid. I'd actually forgotten about that proposal. The one that's big on my radar right now is forgiving student loan debts. I'm afraid that's going to go. And if that goes through, we open up a huge can of worms, because what he's proposing is to give $10,000 worth of forgiveness to student loans, $10,000 per student. Well, what about the students next year who are just starting college? And they're going to say, well, where's my money? These guys got their loans forgiven to the tune of 10,000. I want mine forgiven. And so we're going to start this sequence of, every year it's going to be $10,000 of forgiveness. And then you're going to have, the people who worked hard, worked 2 jobs to pay cash for college, saying quite rightly, how come I sacrificed so that I didn't have debt, and these guys got their debt forgiven, I get nothing. And then you're going to have the homeowners raising their hands, saying, well, wait a minute, you're saying student loan debt is a problem. Have you looked at mortgage debt? Our mortgages need to be forgiven. And you open up this apparently unending sequence of people with their hands out saying we want our debt forgiven. Now, if we get to the point, and I think we're getting there, if we get to the serious point that people are comfortable with the government printing money, good God, they're just going to print it, and they're going to be paying off all of this stuff, and that will come back to haunt all of us very, very quickly in the form of pretty massive inflation.
Yeah. And that's what I thought when the student debt thing. I was like, well, what happens if I already paid my student debt the last 3 or 4 years? Well, do I get a check for
Right.
$10,000?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a weird thing. If you wanted to design government policy that encouraged people to behave irresponsibly, it would look exactly like this. Penalize the people who behave responsibly and reward the people who behave irresponsibly.
Right. Well, does that?
Yeah, it's literally as bad as it can be.
Right. And I think like, as far as big government and small government goes, the more and more we get more comfortable as a society allowing governments to basically fit the bill for our mistakes or our bad decisions or whatever it is, it becomes easier for them to infiltrate our day to day, right? Because I remember you told me, Anthony, that like, the president really doesn't have that much to do with your everyday life. Or was it James? I think it's James said that to me last time, which it's always like, oh, the president's going to change my life. And then I look back on my life, I'm like, wait, none of these guys just really changed like how I live my life or anything day to day. I know they may for other, demographics of people, whatever, but in a nutshell, like it doesn't really make that big of a difference. I think you said your local people are really what care, but my first question was kind of, does that open the floodgates of the government just coming in my living room now, regulating whatever I can and cannot do?
Well, I think part of what happens here is if you allow the government to start handing out money for things, you're also simultaneously inviting it to have say in what these things are. So if the government on a routine basis is going to be forgiving student loan debt for higher education, I imagine pretty quickly you're going to have proposals coming out of Congress to craft what higher education should look like. And they should offer these courses over here and not offer those courses, and it should be, so many credit hours and all of this. And Congress will say, oh no, we understand the federal government doesn't have the authority to dictate what higher education should look like, and we're not dictating it. We're just saying that if your college doesn't look like this, we're not going to forgive your students' loans. And if you want an example of that, I give you the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. Constitutionally, the federal government has no authority to set national speed limits. And Congress knew this back when it set the national 55. What did it do? It didn't say every state has to have a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. It said it's up to the states. You set your own speed limit. But if it's higher than 55, you're not getting highway funds.
Level of compliance, 100%.
What?
Yep.
That's exactly what happened.
That's so fucked up, man.
Yeah, it was a concerted effort, right? It was in the 1980s, and we just browbeat the states into agreeing. And you come to find out there are any number of things exactly like this. Well, of course there are. That's the path of least resistance, which is exactly what politicians are looking for.
Once you start taking government money, you invite the government to dictate how that money is spent.
Yeah, and it was really quite hilarious with the speed limit deal, because the immediate justification was we have to break our dependence on foreign oil, and if you drive slower, it will be more efficient and you won't use as much fuel. When that didn't land with the American people, then you get 55 saves lives. This was a nationwide compliance advertisement, right? 55 saves lives. And then a bunch of assholes like Antony, who look at data, made the not hard to understand conclusion that in all the places that lowered their speed limit to get to 55, death rates have gone up.
What?
So did it break our reliance on foreign oil? Nope, far from it. Did it save lives? No.
Oh my God.
So why the hell did we have it? We had it because it's what politicians wanted.
Yeah. Jesus Christ.
Dig a little bit, you'll always see this kind of crap in the end.
That is so then as far as the college debt, like what's the argument? I always hear people say, and I've kind of tried to think this way too, of like, well, college is more expensive. Back in the day, you could work a summer job, a part-time job even, and pay your way through college. Now you can't. So is that even true? Is that why people are so like, well, my school cost $100,000 and 40 years ago it cost $50,000. You know what I mean?
Look, the cost of tuition has gone up. There's no question about that. But when people cite the high cost of tuition, what they're often doing is picking an Ivy League school and the sticker price. Nobody pays the sticker price. The average college student today pays less than half of the quoted sticker price. And the rest of it comes in the form of scholarships and grants from the university itself. So you can get a very good college education for pennies on the dollar if you just shop correctly.
No, that's right. And Ant stumbled right into the real issue, right, when you said Ivy League institutions. Well, if you're looking to pay your way through school, that's not where you're going to go. It's just that simple. Now, if you're a resident of Arizona, if you're an Arizonan, you can go to any one of our major universities, state universities here in state for $12,000 a year. If you can't make $12,000 a year in a part-time job, you're doing it wrong. Right? Now, there's other things that come into this, right? You're going to have to figure out where you're going to live and how you're going to eat and where the books are coming from. But if we look at tuition as the driving factor, it's really not here, not at that level. And you poke around in the states and you start to realize that not every state, but almost every state has a pretty good option at the state school level. I went to a state school because, stay with me now, it's all I could afford back then. I was every bit as smart then as I am now. That had nothing to do with it. What I needed was a place I could afford. And the state school in state was the only one I could afford. And I was damn happy to be there. Right? Yeah, there were people at Yale 50, 60 miles away. And good for them. That was never a possibility for me. And I'm in league with reality enough to admit that. It may not be fair, but you've got to admit it when it happens, right? Well, why are we always talking about Duke and Stanford and Yale and Harvard? Why aren't we talking about the University of North Carolina, the University of Connecticut, University of Arizona? These are perfectly good schools. And almost everybody can afford them. Why? Because that was their mission in the first place. They're large
And
land-grant universities designed to be cheap.
And remember, we keep using this word, and I do as well. We keep using the word afford. That's not the right word. The right word is finance. And everybody can finance a college education. By finance, I mean you can go and you can get loans that will pay for the college education. So everybody, down to the poorest American right now, can obtain the loans necessary to go to college. Now, paying them back, that's another matter. That's where the word afford comes in. And it turns out that pretty much everybody can afford to pay back their student loans, provided that they've majored in something that has market value. So when you see on the news, people saying, I'm $80,000 in debt and all I can do is get this minimum wage job at Starbucks and this isn't fair. They never ask what the person majored in. And I guarantee you those aren't finance majors. Those aren't engineering majors.
Damn, no.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, those are Elizabethan poetry majors, right? It's something that the market doesn't care about or doesn't need. Now, you can go to school and study those things, and in no small way, I did that myself. You study what's important to you, but you better have a backup plan for when you're looking for work.
Now, you praised us for our predictions, so I'm going to give you another one. We'll see if this one comes true. And my prediction is, if indeed we go forward with this $10,000 loan forgiveness, I guarantee you very quickly you're going to see college tuition rising by about $10,000.
That's right.
Because what universities are going to do is realize that all of a sudden the federal government has dumped $10,000 into students' laps, so we can now charge more.
Yeah, how do we find a way to rake that right into our bank accounts? Yep. I think that goes without saying. I'm going to give you a longer shot of a prediction. I say that if the student loan thing happens, and I have every reason to believe it's going to, it's a terrible idea that will harm lots of people. So of course that's what we're going to do. Of course it is. But after we do that, I predict that within 3 years of that day, you're going to see a very serious movement to get people off the hook of their mortgages. There's going to be some kind of mortgage relief act of 20 whatever.
Right.
And because if you can do it with a college student, you can absolutely do it with a mortgage. Those are not different things in the world, right? Those are the same thing. It's debt that
actually,
we're looking at.
it's easier doing it with a mortgage. There's an asset on the other side that has market value.
And look, I looked this up not too long ago, and I believe that mortgage debt outpaces college loan debt by a factor of 8 or 10.
Yeah, I think it's rough ballpark 10 to 1. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot more people with mortgages. Of course, here's the difference: when people take out a mortgage, they ask some basic questions like, "Will I be able to repay this?" And when people take out student loans, they ask other questions. Where can I go to school with this? Can I go to Harvard? Yeah, this is what, and the idea of being responsible for college students very rarely plays. We've got a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds out making bonehead decisions. Well, of course they are. They're 18 and 19. Every 18-year-old makes bonehead decisions. But now we're going to start forgiving the debt that comes with those bonehead decisions, and you can bet that there's all hell going to break loose from that.
Right. No, I could totally see that happening. And honestly, I know I don't know if it's like a testing thing, but like the rent forgiveness and all these things that are happening right now with the pandemic, like landlords are like right now, if I didn't pay my rent right now, which I have for the last, ever since I've lived here, but during the pandemic, like I don't know how much I wouldn't have gotten in trouble. I wouldn't have been evicted. I couldn't have been kicked out. Like there's a lot of things that wouldn't have happened otherwise, it being a pandemic. So, I don't know if this might be like a test phase or something with that, but like, what's going to happen with that? Like if I didn't pay my landlord the whatever thousands of dollars it is every month, and then our lease is up in May and I move out, am I responsible for that? Can't I just say the pandemic?
Well, can he say that? Because he's going to make the exact same argument. He's got a mortgage to pay. You've got rent to pay. Turns out it's the same building.
Right. Right. Yeah, so what happens is, we allow renters not to pay rent, and the next thing you know is the renters are going to be kicked out by the bank,
right.
which has repossessed the building.
Wow.
Right. And that's just how it is, right? I mean, most landlords live a very difficult hand-to-mouth kind of life. They build up an interest in an asset, right? They're property owners that they pay for over time. But when they're in year 10 of a 30-year mortgage, right, they've got to make those payments. And if everybody stops paying rent the same day for whatever the reason, doesn't even matter what the reason is, they're going to have a lot of trouble making their note. And if they can't make their note, the bank will repossess and you'll be out on the streets. So will the landlord. So we finally found a way that everybody can lose. So you can bet that's what we're going to do.
And where does all of this comes from people who mean well, but are more interested in tweaking the system than they are in understanding why the system is the way it is. And so you have people who see all these renters giving these checks to landlords month after month, and in their minds the landlords have built up this stock of gold and they swim in it back here. It doesn't occur to anybody that the landlord, that money turns right around into fixing the roof, into repainting the place, into paying the mortgage, whatever it is. There is no pile of money. That money is going into maintaining the building that they're paying rent for.
Right.
Right.
Damn. Yeah. All right. Well, that's crazy. We were at it for like an hour now. Look at us.
It gets a little depressing towards the end, right?
You got our dander up now.
Yeah, it's like I'm gonna freaking super depressing. Well, so I get it. You guys are not big government.
No, not really.
Duh.
No, and let me underline that for a moment, because people often confuse when we say we're not big government, they think that we don't want all these things that people want, and that's not it at all. I think it would be great if we had a system in which people who were needy were taken care of, and we had good education, all of that. Our point is that humans are imperfect, fallible creatures, and if we do this in a market environment where there's constant feedback and people are held accountable for their decisions, we can achieve all these wonderful things in a low cost, high efficiency way. But if we ask government to do it with those same imperfect humans, all of a sudden we set up a system where the incentives are all perverse. There's not that feedback mechanism. There's not the built-in incentives. If you do the job right, you get rewarded, and if you do it poorly, you get kicked out on your butt. It's actually quite the opposite. If you do the job poorly, you get more. You can command more tax revenue to be used for this thing, because if we only spent more money, we could really solve the problem.
Right. Damn. You guys are smart.
And so we don't have good answers, right?
It's true. You have good answers.
It's not that we don't want these things. It's that we want these things done via markets rather than done via government.
Right.
Agreed.
And what the market's
completely.
asking for or showing, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ant. You picked the one thing that we could agree on wholesale.
I was gonna say that's like the one time that both of you guys are like, yeah, that's all right, cool. Well, do you have any new books coming out or anything that you guys want to?
We should probably get around to writing another one, but you can buy our first one anytime you want. It's called Cooperation and Coercion, with a big long subtitle that even I haven't memorized yet. So available at Amazon and every other online place that sells books.
Check out our podcast, Words and Numbers. James, you want to talk about your presidential run?
Oh yeah, please.
Well, just a teaser right now, right? I'm actually ahead of the fact, developing a suite of people that will act as cabinet members. So not only will I introduce myself as a potential candidate, I'll have already picked a cabinet by the time I do it. So we're gonna try and run through the Libertarian Party, and we'll see what happens.
Like legit.
Oh yeah.
Oh shit.
Yeah, I'm in the mood to
2024.
do something serious instead of, what we usually do. So yeah, 2024. We're already working on it. Anthony, would you like to tell them? Ant will of course be vice president, and then after 2 terms, Hilbert and I can leave. I think we can all. Why don't we just admit right now there probably won't be 2 terms? I'm just saying, but there are things that we can do that might make this a better prospect for everyone. Right? We might be able to drive the conversation to a reasonable place, because what Ant and I realized during the last fiasco, Trump on the one side and a dozen or so crackpot Democrats on the other. No one, not one person in the march, in all of the debates, in all of the political ads, not one person talked about the federal debt.
Yep.
Can you even believe that? $30 trillion and nobody can even bother to mention it? People need to kiss my ass. That's all I'm going to talk about. And we're going to talk about it like reasonable, intelligent people. And hopefully the other people in the other parties will take notice and adopt a similar approach, right? Because that's the approach we need. We don't need people giving lip service to these things. We need people who want to deal with them. And it's becoming impossible to deal with it. We probably don't have much longer where it's even a possibility, remote though it may be, that we could deal with the federal debt. It's gotten that bad.
Jesus. Well, hopefully with you even talking about it,
that's the hope.
We'll bring in the topic of everyone else that has the big names and this and that to kind of make it more apparent.
And, if people don't listen at first, we're just going to say it louder because somebody needs to pay attention to this.
I love that.
Yeah, there it is. Also, Ant, we should probably tell them our Twitter handles. Mine is at James R. Harrigan.
And mine is at Antony Davies.
No H in the Antony.
I'll put it in the description for sure.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Hey,
Corey, it was really great coming. It was really great hanging out with you for a little bit today.
Definitely. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on. And that's another episode of the E4 Explicit podcast. I'll see you next time.
See you later, Corey.